Good morning, Commissioner President Briggs, Commissioner Vice President Decker, Commissioner Bonner, Commissioner Kalanche, Commissioner Sobroff, Mr. Attorney General, Mr. Tiefenk. Thank you for this opportunity for the COVID-19 update information. First, I'll say that this past week, we see a continued decline in the week-to-week cases of new COVID positive tests with 13 additional cases. 9 of those were sworn members, 4 were civilians. Of the 13 cases, 11 of those cases were individuals that were vaccinated. That's 85%. And as we move forward, we now stand at, as a historic land point, 58.6% of those individuals who have been impacted by COVID with a COVID-19 positive test have been vaccinated. This last case is of 13 cases. That's a 32% reduction from last week. And again, it's 12-week, week-over-week decline. Other aspect I'd like to report is we've seen a continued improvement with the number of individuals who are at home. We now have 61 of our members that are at home recovering from COVID. That's a reduction of 36 fewer employees. And we also saw an improvement with our long haul cases being reduced by 1. We now have 16 long haul cases. An individual that was a long haul case that was hospitalized over the prior 2 reporting periods, he has gone home. I reached out to him this morning just to express to him our continued support for his full recovery. One of the matter that has frequently come up during public comment has been current remarks about the testing and the expense of testing for those individuals that are unvaccinated and require testing. That testing is done on duty, and the testing is at city expense. It's not at the employee's expense or their health care, as a point of clarification. Regarding significant events this past week, I was able to attend the Nickerson Garden Town Hall CSP site. That's my ongoing series of visiting all the sites across the city. It's also a site that has seen a substantial amount of success with a reduction in violent crime. It's had a 29% reduction from 21 versus 20 and a 51% reduction this year to date versus 2019, which is, as you know, a common reference for me as far as the pre-COVID period. I want to express my support for all the community members as well as HACLA and their continued investment. Town Hall gave us a couple hours to talk about the successes, but also the ongoing efforts of improving the gym, improving the collective effort of improving the quality of life there. Again, common refrain of traffic signals, parking controls, safety of children. Again, a community that was working and is working hand in hand together, as well as with us and other members of the stakeholders within CSP to see a lasting and building resilience of that community. Next, yesterday, I want to thank Mayor Garcetti's office, who hosted a luncheon honoring our 2022 Outstanding Service to Domestic Violence Survivors. In that luncheon, it was an opportunity to showcase 5 individuals that we're honoring. This is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I want to thank Mayor Garcetti and his wife, Amy Wakeland. And during their administration, one of their first legacy items was to expand the domestic abuse response team to all 21 areas, 21 stations. And in doing so, also adding to the investment of funding for wraparound services for survivors of domestic violence, as well as their family members. In that period of time, more than 63,000 families have been served. And we've seen, again, lives that have been saved and lives forever changed. Yesterday was an opportunity to honor Valley Bureau Family Justice Center Detective Andrea Marsh, Rampart Domestic Abuse Response Team Officer Anthony Canales, Topanga Domestic Abuse Response Team Officer Samantha Chapman, as well as advocates from Strength United of Monique Canea and Francella Rivera. It is truly a partnership that benefits by both the police and our NGOs, our advocates that ride along with us, that provide for needed services to allow survivors to rebuild their lives. I'm grateful for their dedication, their service. And in looking at the instance of domestic violence as well as child abuse, while we continue to be flat this year as far as the reported instances versus last, I want to draw attention, continued attention to the important need for all of our survivors to recognize that we stand ready and willing, and we need their help and assistance in identifying instances of both spousal abuse as well as child abuse. And why I bring that up is that as we look back between now and 2019, we've seen an 8.7% reduction in spousal abuse and assaults. And we've seen a 24% reduction in child abuse. And my fear is that in both of these instances, that much like sexual assaults go underreported, is that we're seeing as a continued impact of COVID, instances of these cases being underreported and not brought to us. I do know that over the last 2+ years that with the onset of COVID, we reached out to a number of our domestic abuse response team advocates, Gail Pincus and others, and have held ongoing series of calls and outreach because we are continuing to hear from them that their call centers and their advocates and their individuals that help provide counseling services have seen an increase in calls. So we have a bit of a disconnect here. It is part of Domestic Violence Awareness Month to bring up that unfortunate truth and to encourage all of our communities as well as our school administrators and others to be on the lookout and be aware that instances of domestic violence, of child abuse continues, unfortunately, in our society. And that with these decreases that I believe that we have those that have been isolated and somehow have become disconnected from potential services that are offered to them. Moving on to my next topic, I'd like to go into a discussion on a non-tactical unintentional discharge and an officer-involved shooting. Regarding a non-tactical unintentional discharge, on September 28th, at approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, an off-duty Van Nuys detective arrived at work and parked his personal vehicle in their parking structure at the station. And while retrieving work items from his gym bag, the detective noticed that his duty backup weapon in the bag began sliding out of its holster. As the detective took hold of the pistol, he inadvertently fired one round into the concrete floor. There were no other officers near the area where this occurred, and the Van Nuys watch commander was immediately notified. Fortunately, the discharge round did not cause any damage or injury to anyone there. This instance does require a Force Investigation Division response and investigation, and the results of that investigation will be brought before this board after I've had time to review it and make any recommendations as to its findings. Second incident is an officer-involved shooting. This troubling instance. This is the second instance in a little over a week in which officers were fired on by individuals they were attempting to stop and apprehend. This happened on the 29th of September at approximately 9:35 in the evening when uniformed Southeast Gang Enforcement Detail officers responded to a radio call of shots fired in the area of the 11,000 block of South Broadway. While canvassing the area for victims or other evidence of a shooting, their attention was drawn to a male Hispanic walking towards them in the alley from 111th Place. The male reportedly produced a handgun and fired at officers, resulting in one officer returning fire. The individual turned and ran south down the alley and then westbound onto 111th Place, where he again fired at officers. This time, two officers returned fire. The individual ran and entered a driver's seat of a parked SUV. It was white in color with paper plates and fled the scene. Officers immediately broadcasted the vehicle's description and the direction of travel southeast units, who quickly located the vehicle, and a vehicle pursuit ensued, lasting approximately 7 minutes. That vehicle pursuit terminated at 97th and Town Avenue when the individual collided with a series of vehicles, including one vehicle that was driven by a community member. The individual surrendered and was taken into custody without further incident. The community member that was struck by our suspect was treated at the scene for a headache and a left arm injury. Unfortunately, no greater injury than that at this time. The individual that was in the vehicle that had earlier fired on the officers was not struck by gunfire. However, he was transported to a local hospital for abrasions to the head and torso that he sustained from the traffic collision. He was treated for his injuries and cleared for booking. Given the circumstances of the traffic collision, the multidisciplinary collision investigation team responded and conducted a traffic investigation in concert with our Force Investigation Division. No officers were injured during this incident. At the scene of the collision, inside the suspect's vehicle were 3 handguns that were recovered. One was an unloaded Smith & Wesson .380 semi-automatic pistol. A second one was a .38 Colt, a Colt .38 revolver that was reportedly stolen out of Las Vegas some 2 years ago. Inside, the officers located 6 spent casings in the cylinder of this weapon. Additionally, there was a 9mm Smith & Wesson semi-automatic pistol, which was recovered in what was termed a failure to feed, meaning it was loaded with ammunition and apparently suffered some type of malfunction, mechanical malfunction, that created it unable to fire additional rounds. This case was presented to the district attorney's office, and I am reporting that 2 counts of attempt murder on a police officer were filed, 6 counts of attempt assault with a deadly weapon on a police officer with a firearm was filed, 1 count of shooting into an inhabited dwelling, as well as the count of felony evading, and an additional count of assault with a deadly weapon on a civilian. This was the individual that was struck by the fleeing motorist by the suspect, as well as 3 counts of a felon in possession of a firearm. This individual was identified as a male Hispanic, 36 years of age, Gennaro Guevara. And Mr. Guevara remains being held in custody pending his preliminary hearing with a no bail status. As discussed last week, the commission had asked for some official follow-up in that this makes our 29th officer-involved shooting this year versus last year that number was 27. We've had 13 fatals this year versus 10. There's been no change in that number. Our 4-year average for total officer-involved shootings year to date is 23, and our fatal is just under 9 by this time year to date. And looking at the request for additional statistical information, year to date, we've now had 29 officer-involved shootings. 17 of those have involved a firearm. Last year, that number was 27 officer-involved shootings year to date, with 11 involving a firearm. So 59% of our officer-involved shootings this year has involved a firearm, which is a substantial increase from the percentage last year. Additionally, a little more detail on this. This year, we've had 5 officer-involved shootings involving an edged weapon. Last year, that number was 9. So a substantial decrease in the number of officer-involved shootings involving an edged weapon. As for replica firearms, as you recall, shootings that we had 2 weeks ago involving a replica rifle, this year we've had 2 officer-involved shootings involving a replica. Last year, that number at this point was 3. An area that we have seen an increase this year versus last is perceived firearms. This year, out of 29 officer-involved shootings, 5 of those involve a perceived firearm. And last year, that number was 2. Now, of the 5, and looking and researching those, 2 of those were officers responding to radio calls involving the suspect allegedly carrying a gun and pointing that weapon at others. As a quick reminder of these shootings, of these 5, I'll detail briefly. 1 involved in the Newton area, a suspect who was reportedly armed with a gun and pointing the object at responding officers. It was later determined to be a cell phone. 1 involved Southwest, an officer-involved shooting where the suspect fled from a vehicle holding a dark object that the officers believed to be a gun. The third, it was involved Southwest, where a suspect was reportedly armed with a gun, pointing it at officers and others, and it was later determined to be a metal latch actuator. The last 2 was an officer-involved shooting involving a suspect fleeing from a vehicle, which the officer holding something that the officer believed to be a firearm. It was later determined to be an L-shaped butane lighter. And then lastly, an officer recovered a handgun from a suspect and had him directed him to go to his knees. And as the officers waited for a backup, this occurred in the harbor area. The suspect reached into the car and retrieved a dark object turning towards the officer, and the object was later determined to be a cell phone. To the members of the public, as a reminder, within 45 days of any officer-involved shooting or other critical incident, the department publishes a critical incident video. And I encourage that to go to LAPD online and query the critical incident videos. And of every video I've talked about here, with the exception of these last 2 instances, that those most recent 2 shootings are now posted online, and you can see the body-worn video and other video evidence that we've had. None of these officer-involved shootings have been adjudicated to this point. They're all in the process of being evaluated, evidence being gathered, collected, articulated. They'll each come before me after our use of force review board with recommendations on 3 bases: the tactics that were involved, the drawing and exhibiting of a firearm, and the officer's decision to use deadly force. My report will be made to the Board of Police Commissioners, and this commission, as you know, and I'm speaking more towards the public here, that the commission will be the final arbiter as to whether or not these shootings or any use of force involved is in or out of policy. Moving over to crime, we continue to see the rate of increase improve in regards to crime here in the city of Los Angeles. Part 1 crime fell below 10%. The increase fell below 10%. Last week it was a 9.8%. This week closes, and the week before that it was at 10%. We see reductions both in violent crime as well in the rate of interchange as well as in property crime. These are important improvements for us. However, we still must recognize that the rate of shooting violence, while the number of homicides are essentially flat, 304 versus 304 last year, compared to 2019, homicides have increased by 50%. And in regards to shooting violence, well, we've had 26 fewer shooting victims this year versus last, a 2.4% reduction. Versus 2019, we saw a 42% reduction. So I'm encouraged by the rate of violent crime and property crime that those rates are slowing. So we are making incremental progress. I do believe that the efforts of our department and our violent crime reduction added patrols as well as invested added resources in the follow-ups and the arrests of individuals involved in these crimes is making a difference, as well as the criminal justice system coming to bear and being restored, many aspects of it. And then lastly, and most importantly, the community, as they come out of COVID and are working with us and working with each other to improve their ability to prevent crime and to work in partnerships in our efforts of improving public safety. Public safety is a shared responsibility that we're all engaged in. And I look forward to seeing these improvements continue. I know today also the commission will hear our presentation on our follow home bandit investigations and the results of the task force as it approaches its 1-year anniversary. A matter I want to talk briefly also about is our street racing task force efforts. We have seen a continued improvement in the 6th Street Bridge as far as the frequency or circumstances of people going there and doing takeovers or other reckless actions. We continue to have dedicated deployments there in the evening hours, Friday through Sunday, and then regular frequent deployments throughout the rest of the week. This last Saturday in the afternoon, we did see 50 cyclists that went to the location, gathered and began impeding traffic and engaged in a takeover, if you will. Officers were quick to respond. They cited an individual and the others quickly dispersed. Citywide, though, this is still a significant problem. We had 18 misdemeanor arrests over this last week for people engaged in speed contests, 23 impounds of vehicles. There were 4 spectators that were cited for being spectators at a speed contest or demonstration, 107 citations over the course of these 18 reported street takeovers. And the majority of these takeovers are occurring still within the central area of the city, with some also few in the south traffic and on the west side. The Valley this last week, I'm happy to report, did not report any street takeovers, though I'm confident that given the persistence of this issue that there were instances of speed exhibition across there. We just encourage the public again to call us and make us aware when these demonstrations or takeovers begin, and our efforts will be to respond and take efforts to take enforcement efforts as well as to disperse those groups. Lastly, I'll move over to our personnel strength. Unfortunately, we did see a reduction in our overall personnel strength, both sworn and civilians. We now stand at 9,215 sworn deployed members of the organization. That's a reduction of 38 from the period I reported last week. And our civilian workforce is at 2,667. That's a reduction of 5 members of a professional workforce. On Friday, this past Friday, Chair of Public Safety, Councilmember Monica Rodriguez introduced a motion for the personnel department working with the police department to identify a means of improving our recruitment incentives. Many agencies across the country, as I previously reported, have signing bonuses and such. I'm grateful for her movement on that motion and introducing it. There's a special meeting on Thursday of the Public Safety Subcommittee to hear the efforts of the departments, what we believe will be helpful in establishing a hiring bonus for new Los Angeles sworn police officers. And we're also eager to understand what type of hiring incentive can exist for public safety representatives and custody services representatives. Those are two civilian work classes that are in critical need of recruitment, of added staffing. We have shortages in both those areas, significant shortages impacting service levels. And in the police and the custody services, also impacting the number of officers that are working in that assignment versus being available to work the field. So I'm looking forward to the council's actions to establish, again, an incentive program recognizing the difficult job market that we're in and the critical need to add staffing to our ranks. With that, I appreciate your patience on my lengthy report today, and I look forward to your comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Moore. Commissioner Kalanche, any questions for Chief Moore? Commissioner Soboroff, any questions for Chief Moore? Commissioner Bonner, any questions for Chief Moore?
Yes, please. Thank you. Chief, I have three questions. The first one, I actually maybe a couple of questions, but I would appreciate a comment on the shoplifting situation in Central, I believe, that resulted in the death of the store owner. And the question, I think, really is, as I understand, there was both suspects were 17 years old. And so the question is, were they students? What do we know about where they got the gun that was involved, and also just where are they detained, role of the parents? Just give us an overview of a situation like that involves two minor suspects.
So I won't have all this information. What I can tell you is that the owner of this small market or shop in the downtown core has been in the past a frequent target of shoplifting or thefts, petty thefts, is my understanding. On this day, two 17-year-olds, a male and a female, went to that store and stole a series of hair products, hair extensions, is my understanding, and fled the location. The owner gave pursuit and nearby confronted both individuals for the property that they had stolen. And during that confrontation, one of the two subjects produced a handgun in which the store owner was able to effectively disarm the individual. However, the store owner then fell back onto the ground, and the information we have from witnesses at scene is that one of the two subjects then produced a knife or a shank and stabbed the individual to death. The handgun was recovered at scene. Unfortunately, the owner did lose his life there. Witnesses in the area pointed out to responding officers the location of the two individuals. They were taken into custody. There was evidence on their person regarding, including a knife, as well as blood that we believe came from the shop owner. As juveniles, currently this entire matter is before the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office for determination of what charges will be filed relative to this murder, and whether they'll be tried as 17-year-old minors or if they'll be tried as adults. I don't have the source of the gun at this point, nor do I have the status of these two individuals as far as prior criminal involvement or other activity. I do believe it speaks again to the challenge that we have with the far too frequent amount of guns that are in the hands of everyone, and that how it's a simple and relatively low, a simple matter of a theft, which obviously is the livelihood of these shop owners. They strive with thin margins and oftentimes at a loss, and being subjects of thefts and these types of instances, I'm sure is discouraging, and their efforts to try to safeguard their property and their livelihood is understandable. But in the presence of this, then the escalation involving gunplay and loss of a life through the stabbing is just a terrible, terrible circumstance. I'll have, I can and will have Central Homicide follow up with you with some additional information offline as far as the aspects of their prior background with schooling and also the source of the gun.
Thank you. Are you able to say, just generally speaking, in a situation like this involving two minor suspects, are they detained at Central, or where would they be today? It would
be customary. It would be my hope that they're still in the custody of juvenile probation. Mm-hmm. However, I don't have that information before me. I'll have it before the end of the meeting, and I'll get that to you.
Great. Okay, appreciate that. And then two questions on the officer-involved shootings, not on any of the specific cases, but you mentioned, for example, that the number of the 29 that involved a firearm. And the question there is, with regard to involved the firearm, that doesn't necessarily mean that that someone fired at the officers. Is that correct? I mean, do you know how many of those cases involved someone actually using the firearm or firing at the officers?
Of the 17, I know that the last two instances, officers were fired on by the suspects involved. Going back, I'd have to, again, I'll research that and circle back with you as to the other remaining 15 instances.
Okay, and then a question also about proportionality, and that is, when we review the cases involving whether it's any use of force, there's some requirement that it be proportional. And in these cases, when you're dealing with a situation where there's the officer has determined that lethal force is necessary, how does that term proportional apply in those instances? In other words, the specific question really is about the number of rounds that are fired. Is there any expectation one way or the other as to how many rounds, not that you would expect a specific number of rounds, but the question just is there full license to, unload and have a number of officers firing any number of rounds, or is there any expectation in those cases that there would be some effort to limit the number of rounds fired to whatever's required to eliminate the threat?
Well, absolutely. Proportionality speaks to the officer immediate defense of their life. They're in an imminent peril of either losing their life or being seriously injured by this threat. In response to that, they use deadly force as a last resort, and the effort and as they use that deadly force, each round is evaluated on the merits of the continuing threat that is before the officer. And you're right, there's no magic number. Our effort is to obviously not have to resort to deadly force at all. And it is our hope that the number of rounds that are fired is our training is that there's fire control and that officers evaluate after each shot whether or not there's a necessity or a utility to continue. And of course, as you know, as a commissioner with your history, that we look at each round in such a way, and there's often decisions or in our decisions that whether it's 1 round or 5 rounds or 6 rounds or whatever the number, we can find rounds out of policy because it's no longer deemed as an imminent threat and a necessity or last resort of the use of deadly force.
And just briefly, how is that trained? How is that covered in training?
It's part of our use of force policy as well as the application when we go about doing simulations, and whether it be a shooting in a live tackle situation at a situation scenario, say at the academy, or it's in a force option simulator, and then each round is evaluated as to the continued threat. It's reinforced in regards to even bonus or the marksmanship training that is taught at the academy as to the sequence of fires, the sequencing between multiple threats, if you will, more than one person armed. So it's taught in a variety of ways.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Thank you, Commissioner Briggs.
Thank you, Commissioner Bonner. Commissioner Decker, any questions for Chief Moore?
Thank you, Commissioner Briggs. Chief, thank you for the follow-up report from last week on the context for all the OISs. I think that's very helpful, so thank you for that. And just a point of clarification regarding the council issues or the matters before council this week that you spoke of. If I'm understanding you correctly, council has not yet approved the proposed bonus for hiring, but that is part of the matter to be taken up at the special meeting this week. Do I have that right?
That's correct. The motion itself did not identify the monetary amounts the department has in our earlier presentations to you and as well as others. And it's my belief that on Thursday at the meeting, those actual numbers will come out, as well as an extension, which is a civilian professional, an incentive program there. So those specifics will come out on Thursday, I believe, and then for council action to follow, my hopes, quickly thereafter.
Okay, thank you very much, Chief. Just wanted that clarification. Commissioner